Hidden deep within Soviet mountain ranges, hundreds of steam locomotives sat in silence for decades, unmarked on maps and denied by officials. This was no abandonment. It was Operation Strategic Reserve, a Cold War plan to outwit nuclear annihilation by hiding technology that was immune to the very weapon threatening modern life. Why would a superpower cling to relics of the past while racing toward the future? And what does this reveal about the scale of paranoia driving Soviet survival strategy? The answer begins at the moment when nuclear war stopped being unthinkable and became a matter of logistics. In the decades after World War II, Soviet leaders confronted a terrifying new reality, one in which nuclear war was not just possible, but potentially inevitable. The Soviet Union's central planners gathered in ministries and secret councils, combing through scenarios that began with a nuclear flash and ended with the collapse of everything modern life depended on. Their memos, stamped confidential, did not picture victory in the traditional sense. Instead, they described a world where cities were flattened, power grids silenced, and the intricate machinery of the state shattered in seconds. Railways stood at the heart of these survival calculations. The Soviet Union was a land empire stitched together by rail lines stretching thousands of kilometers, carrying grain, coal, troops, and the lifeblood of industry from one end of the continent to the other. Without trains, the country's ability to fight, rebuild, or even feed itself would vanish. Yet the very progress that had modernized these railways, electrification, diesel engines, and sophisticated control systems now looked dangerously fragile. Soviet scientists warned that a single high-altitude nuclear detonation could unleash an electromagnetic pulse so powerful it would fry every circuit, relay, and transformer in its path. The grid would go dark, and with it, the engines that depended on it. A Cold War historian describes this mindset as one of relentless preparation for catastrophe. Soviet doctrine did not assume that nuclear war could be prevented. It assumed that survival depended on planning for the absolute worst. Every ministry, from transportation to agriculture, received instructions to develop fallback options that could function in a world stripped of technology. Council memoranda circulated with chilling precision, listing not just the loss of electricity, but the breakdown of communications, the isolation of entire regions, and the need for self-sufficiency at every level. Within this environment, the idea of preserving steam locomotives was not nostalgia. It was the logical product of a system that measured security in layers of redundancy. If the modern age could be erased, yet in a single instant, then only the simplest, most robust machines would offer any hope of restoring movement and order. In the Soviet calculus, the cost of maintaining such safeguards was justified by the scale of what could be lost. The planners' fear was not just of bombs, but of silence, of a nation stranded, unable to move, unable to recover. That fear shaped decisions in ways that would remain hidden for decades, buried beneath mountains and locked behind layers of secrecy. EMP is not science fiction. Soviet electrical engineers spent years studying what would happen if a nuclear weapon detonated high above the Earth. The math was simple and terrifying. A single blast could unleash a wave of electromagnetic energy strong enough to surge through power lines, fry transformers, and obliterate every circuit board in its path. In a country where modern life depended on electricity, this invisible threat could turn the entire railway network into a graveyard of silent, useless machines. Electric locomotives would become nothing more than dead weight on the tracks, their wires and relays scorched beyond repair. Diesel electrics, with their intricate web of control circuits and semiconductors, would be just as helpless. It didn't matter how new or powerful the engines were. If they relied on electronics, they would be lost in an instant. Steam locomotives, on the other hand, belonged to a different era. Their power came from fire and water, not from wires or chips. Every control, throttle, brake, and whistle was operated by hand through levers and rods. There were no transistors to burn, no circuits to short. As long as there was coal in the tender and water in the boiler, a steam engine could run. Soviet engineers ran calculations and tests, examining every possible way an EMP could couple into a locomotive. The answer was always the same. Without long electrical loops or sensitive electronics, steam engines were almost impossible to disable with electromagnetic energy alone. Even their auxiliary systems, like lights or pumps, could be bypassed or replaced with manual effort if needed. This realization made its way up the chain of command. In the early 1960s, the Council of Ministers issued a classified decree authorizing a new program, Operation Strategic Reserve. The order was simple but sweeping. Hundreds, eventually thousands of steam locomotives would be pulled from retirement, refurbished, and hidden away in secure locations. These machines would serve as the ultimate insurance policy, ready to roll out if the world above was plunged into darkness. The existence of the Strategic Reserve was known only to a handful of officials, engineers, and maintenance crews sworn to secrecy. For decades, the plan remained buried in the files of the Soviet state. Its logic was clear to anyone who understood the physics of war. When electricity fails, only the oldest machines survive. Hidden in the folds of the Ural Mountains, a network of secret depots took shape, places chosen not just for their remoteness, but for their strategic value. Soviet planners zeroed in on regions like Perm Krai, where the landscape offered both concealment from prying eyes and natural barriers against nuclear blast waves. The Shumkovo facility stands as the most notorious example. Tucked several hundred meters from the main railway line, it was invisible to the casual traveler and largely absent from civilian maps. Here, as many as 140 steam locomotives once sat in orderly lines, their black hulks pressed shoulder to shoulder, each one a silent contingency plan. The location was no accident. The Urals were far from Western missile targets and close to the coal fields that fed Soviet industry. Water, essential for the boilers, was plentiful along the railway. The depot's proximity to both resources made it possible to keep the engines ready for use even if supply lines elsewhere were shattered. Satellite imagery, now public, shows how the yard was tucked into a patchwork of forest and hills, terrain that shielded it from aerial reconnaissance and, in theory, from the worst effects of a nuclear strike. Secrecy at Shumkovo was absolute. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and the workers responsible for the engines signed confidentiality agreements that lasted for decades. The depot operated under protocols familiar to any military installation. Access was tightly controlled, records were kept under lock and key, and the presence of so many engines in one place was never discussed outside the inner circle. Even the routine coming and going of maintenance crews was managed to avoid drawing attention. Locomotives that arrived for storage were often shunted in at night, their serial numbers logged in handwritten ledgers that have only recently surfaced in railway archives. Photographic evidence, captured since the 1990s by explorers and railway enthusiasts, shows rows of steam engines with faded red stars stamped on their smokebox doors, lined up in overgrown yards. Some images are tagged with Global Positioning System coordinates, pinpointing the exact location of Shumkovo and confirming stories that had once been dismissed as Cold War myth. The hulking frames are rusted now, but the scale of the operation is unmistakable. At its peak, Shumkovo was just one node in a much larger web. A network of hidden reserves stretching across the mountains, each one a piece of the Soviet Union's ultimate backup plan. The success of this concealment lay not just in geography, but in discipline. For decades, Western intelligence agencies had only the faintest hints that such depots existed. The true extent of the reserve and the logic behind its location remained secret until the Soviet collapse. Only then did the photographs and satellite data begin to tell the full story. A vast hidden fleet waiting in silence for a catastrophe that never arrived. Inside the mountain depots, the work never truly stopped. Even as the world outside moved on to diesel and electric power, a small cadre of railwaymen kept the old engines alive. Their days began before dawn, boots crunching on gravel, steam from their breath mixing with the morning fog as they unlocked heavy doors to reveal rows of black iron giants. Each locomotive was more than a relic. It was a responsibility. Foremen's journals, now yellowed with age, describe routines that ran like clockwork. Every few weeks, crews crawled beneath the hulking frames to grease bearings and oil valve gear, their hands stained with graphite and machine oil. Pistons and rods received fresh lubricant to guard against the slow creep of rust. Boiler plates were wiped down with protective oils, and exposed metal was inspected for the first signs of corrosion. Twice a year, the silence would break with the hiss and rumble of a pressure test. Crews filled boilers with water, then fired up a small coal blaze to slowly bring the pressure up to operating levels, careful not to rush, watching for leaks or weaknesses in the old steel. Any faulty rivet or hairline crack was logged and repaired, no matter how minor. The journals mention the importance of keeping the water tanks full and the coal piles dry. Coal was delivered by the wagon load and stacked in covered sheds, rotated so that the oldest fuel would be used first. Water towers were checked for leaks and kept ready. Even in the harshest winters, when pipes could freeze solid overnight, spare parts, gaskets, bolts, lengths of pipe were boxed and labeled, lined up on shelves for the day the engines would be called back into service. Nothing was left to chance. Even the fire buckets were filled and hung in their places. The air in the sheds was thick with the scent of oil and coal dust, a reminder that these machines were not museum pieces but sleeping workhorses. The men assigned to these duties knew the stakes. Their signatures filled the margins of the maintenance logs, each entry a quiet promise that if disaster struck, the engines would answer the call. Some foremen wrote in the margins, short notes about a stubborn valve or a new shipment of Welsh coal, pride mingling with anxiety. Every month a checklist was ticked off: lubricate rods, inspect bearings, test pressure, rotate coal, check water, inventory spares. The work was repetitive, but it meant that, at a moment's notice, a locomotive could be brought to a boil, steam up, and roll out into a world that had lost everything else. The system was simple, but it worked. Decades after the last passenger train left under steam, the reserve engines remained ready, their fires banked but never quite out. The foreman's journals, preserved in railway archives, offer a window into a world where readiness was measured not in minutes or hours, but in careful, patient routines. Each one was a safeguard against a future no one wanted to see. Activation orders, kept in sealed envelopes at mountain depots, outlined a step-by-step timetable for bringing the strategic steam reserve to life. At the first sign of a national catastrophe, depot foremen would break the seals and initiate a sequence practiced only in theory. Maintenance logs from the Shumkovo facility detail how every locomotive was assigned a readiness rating and a crew roster, with names penciled in beside each engine's serial number. The plan called for simultaneous ignition across all hidden depots. Firemen would stack coal into fireboxes, draw water from tanks, and begin the slow process of raising steam pressure. Within hours, the first engines would be ready to move, clearing debris from main lines and hauling emergency supplies to isolated towns. Economic historians who have studied the available ledgers point to a separate line in the Ministry of Railways' annual budgets, labeled only as Strategic Reserve Maintenance. In the early 1980s, this line item reached well into the millions of rubles each year, enough to fund the salaries of hundreds of workers, purchase fuel and lubricants, and keep spare parts in constant rotation. The cost was never discussed in public. Internal memos tracked the tons of coal delivered each quarter, the cost of anti-corrosion treatments, and the routine replacement of boiler gaskets and bearings. A ledger from 1983 lists 2,800 tons of coal allocated to a single Ural depot, enough to keep a fleet of locomotives running for weeks. Other entries detail expenditures on water purification, oil for axle bearings, and even winter uniforms for crews stationed in unheated sheds. The numbers add up quickly. One historian calculates that, over 3 decades, the total cost of maintaining the steam reserve across all depots ran into the hundreds of millions of rubles. For a nation struggling to provide basic goods to its citizens, the decision to funnel scarce resources into a dormant fleet of iron giants reveals the scale of the Soviet commitment to survival at any price. The ledgers offer no explanation, only columns of figures, coal, water, wages, each one a silent investment in a plan for a world that thankfully never arrived. NATO planners facing the same nuclear threats took a different path. The Western approach focused on pushing technology forward, hardened electronics, layered defenses, and contingency plans that assumed the survival of modern systems. In the United States and Western Europe, railway modernization meant investing in diesel and electric locomotives, but it also meant designing critical infrastructure with electromagnetic pulse resistance in mind. Military command centers, communication networks, and some railway equipment were shielded or built with vacuum tube technology aiming to weather the electromagnetic storm. Yet nowhere in the West did governments set aside vast fleets of steam locomotives as a fallback. The belief in technological progress and faith in deterrence shaped their preparations. The contrast became clear after 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved and its secrets began to surface. As the old order crumbled, explorers and railway enthusiasts ventured into the mountains, following rumors and faded maps. One explorer, recalling his first visit to the Shumkovo depot, described the eerie silence, rows of rusting steam locomotives, their red stars barely visible beneath layers of grime and moss. GPS coordinates and satellite images confirmed what had once been dismissed as Cold War legend. The reserve was real, and its scale was staggering. Museum curators soon joined the effort to document and rescue what they could. The ER-716-66, a Hungarian-built engine from 1936, became one of the first to be pulled from the weeds and restored for public display at the Museum of Battle Glory of Ural. But for every locomotive saved, hundreds remained abandoned, scattered across the Urals and beyond, silent reminders of a vanished world. The restoration process is slow and expensive. Most museums lack the resources to tackle more than a handful of these iron giants, and the majority remain where they were left, their fate uncertain. Today, the evidence is plain to anyone willing to look. Photographs, archival footage, and first-hand accounts reveal a story that stretches from the height of Cold War paranoia to the uncertain aftermath of the Soviet collapse. The hidden steam reserves, once a closely guarded secret, now stand as monuments to a uniquely Soviet vision of survival, a vision that set it apart from every other nation caught in the nuclear age. Today, the rusting engines stand as silent warnings. Even the most advanced systems can collapse in a moment, leaving only what we've quietly prepared. As digital infrastructure grows more fragile under new threats, from cyber attacks to EMP attacks, resilience depends on what we are willing to preserve, not just invent. Sometimes survival favors the forgotten over the cutting edge. What would we hide away just in case?